talk about the dialogue between Paul VanderKlay and John Vervaeke. I think this is my favorite dialogue yet, and I saw in Paul's comments some people who agreed with me. So one thing that makes these two men really wonderful to watch is that John Vervaeke is a non-theist with a serious understanding of Christianity, and Paul VanderKlay is a pastor who's very high in openness. So it makes the conversation really interesting because they can really cross over in areas even that they disagree in, and it's really interesting. They actually end up remarking on this at the end of the dialogue, but I had been thinking about it already. So one thing I really envy about both of them is their ability to think on their feet. I have a hard time coming up with the right word often, so interviews like what they're doing can be difficult for me. I really have to write everything out. So a lot of times when I do these, it's using really copious notes, or even I've written out the whole dialogue, the whole presentation. So the dialogue's amazing, and it's really indicating how these dialogues are layering onto each other and entering a new realm of meaning. And I want to point out some things that resonated with me. There's a lot of interesting stuff in here. I can't get to all of it, some of it just because I haven't made up my mind, I guess, or even have anything to say about it really. But obviously I'm going to look at what they said, give some of my own thoughts, and look at what they said through a Pirsigian lens as usual. Okay, so one of the first things, in fact, the first major idea was that COVID-19 is making John Vervaeke's work more relevant. Well, that certainly makes a lot of sense because it kind of exaggerates the meaning crisis, I guess you could say. And when we go into subjectivity, we'll talk about that. And I love what Paul said here because it is very Pirsigian. It's a shamanic disruption that affords new opportunities. So that's a positive way to look at it. One of the problems we're having, I think, is not having a positive attitude about what the universe presents to us when it presents it to us. So they talked about Damas ID, which is a concept out of John Vervaeke's work. And he said that people are losing home. I mean, obviously, it isn't necessarily that you're losing your home physically, but in a lot of ways, he said cosmological and cultural domicile. And the world seems unsafe and or is not available. But in this case, it's sort of a combination of the two. You sort of have you're actually physically constrained. So your home, which contained the rest of the outdoors, the restaurants, everything, is not available to you. So yeah, it's domiciled in that sense, but it's also domiciled in the sense that we've been so lucky for so long. I mean, you wouldn't think so looking at Twitter and everything else, but everything is so peaceful and great, and everyone is really, most people are taken care of to a large extent. Remember, I worked in social work, so even poor people have access to as much food really as they want. Most poor people have a cell phone because Medicaid pays for it. Medicaid, I mean, I'm looking at DC. I know it's a little bit different from some other places, but you really have even the poorest of the poor in the United States get some kind of service in a way that they didn't used to, let's say. And there are not that many homeless people. You're also going to get an idea that there's so many homeless people from these things that they say about California and stuff. But most people have access to housing. Remember, a lot of homeless people don't want the housing offered to them. Not that I blame them, but the way that it's the thinking, there's a lot more freedom, especially if in your place like California, if you are at that low level of cognitive functioning in terms of delusional disorders. Sometimes it's better to be outside in a place like California than it is in some shelter or some subsidized housing. So I just want to put that out there. So the point I'm making is that things are really good, and now you've got something that makes you think that things are not all that good. So John Vervaeke says that there might be a mental health tsunami. Yeah, we psychologically project this preoccupation with safety we have onto the virus. It's not that deadly. It's deadly to some people, I know. But many of us are treating this as if it's the Black Plague. And what I'm noticing is the mental health of people who participate in this, who are able to participate at the highest level in this stability and safety and abundance of this society are the ones freaking out the most. It's really interesting. And also the people who are able to work from home. So there's a lot of projection onto this thing, and I think actually there's a benefit to coming face to face with our biological reality, because this is something we never come face to face to. We really live in a very comfortable bubble, and our world is largely virtual these days. So later in this dialogue, John is going to focus on how we're so illiterate in spiritual and imaginal ways. And I would say we are also biologically illiterate. We are so comfy and removed from bodily risk that we forget, we're advanced animals. And there is a lot of technology between us and the actual environment, the destructive side of Mother Nature, let's just say. So they talked about subjectivity. So with the world closed off to us here, we're indoors, we have Zoom, we have the computer, we have the internet. That's really what we've got. So the better part of experience for us without being able to go outside. Now, I know a lot of this is changing. I know things are opening up and stuff, but let's just talk about the worst part of this. So during that time, subjectivity was the better part of our experience. And what we find there isn't anything we feel part of that is greater to serve as a counterbalance, let's just say, when John says this, to the reciprocal narrowing. Our world has narrowed, and it's causing us, and we are in a narrow state of mind because we haven't really developed the capacity to feel like we're part of something bigger. But it used to be that this subjectivity was the normal state of being, and now we have so many distractions. So this having to confront our subjective experience calls into question our self-sufficiency, they said. So contrast this lack of self-sufficiency with this philosopher, William James. It's so interesting to read this biography because I keep reading at it, but every time you get into William James' inner life, it's so rich and complex, and he's always reading something, and he's always taking notes and critiquing what he reads, etc. So we can still actually do that kind of thing. There's so much available for us, and we can enrich ourselves with the opportunity to take advantage of the wealth of knowledge that James would actually love, I think. He was so erudite, and this is such an opportunity to cultivate something that results in self-sufficiency. So Pirsig himself actually wanted to get away from everything. So he would write, from 2 to 6 in the morning, for example, when no one was around in a coffee shop. And toward the end of writing Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, there's a book called Deep Work by a Georgetown professor called Cal Newsom, which is about unplugging and how you can think deeply about things. And of course, a lot of what Paul and John are talking about is the inability to think deeply about things, to get into that mode of thinking. So a lot of what they're talking about, the meaning crisis, etc., is a problem with subjectivity, the fact that once we're in a subjective state, we really don't know what to do with ourselves. They're also talking about how spontaneously mythological thinking is emerging around the COVID virus. And if you're starving for meaning, says John, archetypical mythopoetic stuff, when it comes up, you really latch on to it. And he said in a talk with Zach Stein, who I think is an educator, that religious illiteracy exacerbates this. And that is true, because if you have a lot of these mythopoetic images, which just are part of our collective unconscious and a part of our mythos, or the collective unconscious really is the way to describe it, you don't have any place to put them. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but there's a lot of conspiracy theories because of that, because you get these images in your head and they latch on to these conspiracy theories. which is desperately trying to find a narrative order behind the chaos, they said. So one of them is coming up is Bill Gates and the world order, which of course, like most conspiracy theories, has some plausibility to it. It's a hierarchical, it's a manifestation of the hierarchy of which Bill Gates is at the top. But there's some plausibility to it, because if the economy is global and there's a few people at the top of this global hierarchy, then it does sort of resemble trying to restructure world order. Now, to look at it that way as some kind of, world order that's going to come down and capture you, I don't know if that's useful. So where is it in that conspiracy theory that we can really pull something out of that helps us make sense of all this? But really, here's the issue they're talking about. Because we don't have a handle on the mythology, it does threaten to possess us in these malevolent depictions of Bill Gates. He's going to come for you on a biological level too, because we don't understand our biological relationship to the world anymore. And so these conspiracy theories threaten to possess us. It's shadow. So postmodern green, in Ken Wilber terms, it has tried to cut us off from the mythos. And you can actually see that it's done that for us. If you're cut off from everything that's come beforehand, which is what the postmodern green has successfully convinced us to do, everything else is bad. It's the patriarchy. It's primitive. We're so advanced. Everyone back then was racist and sexist and all that stuff. You're going to actually see the collective unconscious manifest in strange ways, because we don't have any guidance as to what these ancient patterns mean. Where the green will convince you that it has to do with bad, archaic things that we don't need anymore, and the new atheists do the same thing. They say religion is just a pathology, and that enlightened thinkers have laid waste to religion, and anyone else stuck in that is very primitive. But in terms of the mythos and religion and the collective unconscious, we know way better than that how important these things are, and how this is these concepts go all the way back to the first sign of life on Earth, and in Pirsigian philosophy even further back than that. But that's for another day, when I actually understand metaphysics of quality better than I do now. So like John said, anything that is powerful and that has the capacity for transformation of agency in arena can slam you, and this COVID certainly is doing that. It's what's happening. And literally, people are moving, for example, wanting to move out of California and go to Texas because of the lockdown. So that's domicide right there. And think of this. No one's allowed to visit beaches in California. That's domicide. So then they mentioned Descartes and subjectivity, and it's something I don't know much about, or anything about really. But Paul and John said that Descartes equates soul and the conscious mind, equate the soul with the conscious mind. So that moment where consciousness touches itself, the center of subjectivity, you see that this is the sense of soul. And it is, in Plato, the intermediary between transcendence and immanence. So think about Pirsig. It's the determined pre-intellectual. Then there's the awareness of that pre-intellectual spontaneously, and then there's a willful manifestation of it. It's the same pattern over and over again. And notice determined pre-intellectual and willful manifestation. It addresses both determinism and free will in the same dynamic. As a tangent, this is why the metaphysics of quality is so it was considered by people who follow it superior, because it does address these philosophical and metaphysical problems, free will and determinism being one of them. But what the point I'm making, sorry about that tangent, the point I'm making is that this is a pattern that you're going to see over and over again, which is this pre-intellectual spontaneity, an awareness of that, and then taking it out in the world. So transcendence and immanence, I think, is how you can kind of lay that on that particular pattern, and the intermediary between. So Tillich uses this language of moreness, and it's a way of talking about the mystery we participate in, and that mystery is inexhaustible. And then suchness is the mystery of individuation. So Paul said you negotiate the moreness and the suchness. Well, what does that sound like? That sounds like the moreness is dynamic quality, totally available, like every possible combination totally available to you. And that dynamic, and that the suchness is static quality. So that's another reflection of the pattern we're talking about: intuition, expression, mythos, logos, the Tao, the 10,000 things. And it also mirrors what McGilchrist says about the brain. And if our thinking is like that, according to McGilchrist, then we're going to see this pattern everywhere. We can't help it. This is the nature of our understanding, of how our brain works and our understanding of everything all the time. So how can we actually learn how to use this mythopoetic material that we're pretending is archaic and that is irrelevant? So what Paul and John say is that we have to search for lost faculties. And John said machinery that's been backgrounded, suppressed, marginalized. Again, this is that what Green did, is cut off all that stuff as irrelevant, or beginning with Enlightenment and going up to Green where you really cut it off. And what can help us regain these faculties? Well, one thing that's happening in this corner with John and his channel is, of course, the Dialogos. There's a lot of Jungian influence in this corner, so active imagination and embodied practices like what John was talking about, Tai Chi. I just spoke to an Anglican minister yesterday, and I'm going to be posting this conversation we had that addresses some of these things. And he said that he used singing as an embodied practice, and certainly chanting in both Western and Eastern contemplative traditions are trying to get you back to that lost faculty, that ability to understand, let's just say, the ground of being or the real world, that gets you back into that dimension that is bigger than you. All right, so then they start talking about narrative, which is really interesting, and faith and finesse. So finesse requires us relating to God as a person, says Paul. But does it really, says John, who points to his practice of Tai Chi, which has no narrative structure. It's more like the flow state, and the flow state is being in that state of holiness, of sacredness, of gumption. I think they're related. I think they are parallel. And later also we'll see the Anglican minister, Andrew, who I spoke with, talk about this flow state as a holy state and what it means to him as a Christian. So let's look at something that can be interpreted both ways. Let's look at the experience of St. John of the Cross. So it's a very experiential, very mystical experience, but then he brings in a narrative to describe it, which is that of the bride and the bridegroom. So he's the bride, Christ is the bridegroom, and with that kind of, it's an erotic imagery, but it's a participatory, it's a way of describing participatory knowing. And also in the Bhagavad Gita, you've got that sense of connection with the sacred, is Atman, is Brahman. So there's a narrative in there. But the underlying principle of that thing, okay, so we're looking at St. John of the Cross, Bhagavad Gita. They're both experiential, mystical, non-narrative, but they have a narrative element to them. The Western narratives, I would say, tend to be a little bit more detailed. So let's look at that essential experience, though, from the Eastern point of view, which is Tat Tvam Asi, which means you are that. And I'm going to read from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance on that experience. In all of the Oriental religions, great value is placed on the Sanskrit doctrine of Tat Tvam Asi, thou art that, which asserts that everything you think you are and everything you think you perceive are undivided. To realize fully this lack of division is to become enlightened. Logic presumes a separation of subject from object, therefore logic is not final wisdom. The illusion of separation of subject from object is best removed by the elimination of physical activity, mental activity, and emotional activity. There are many disciplines for this. One of the most important is the Sanskrit jnana, mispronounced in Chinese as Chan, and again mispronounced in Japanese as Zen. So you're talking about a meditation practice. Everyone agrees you need to have a meditation practice. So Tattvam Asi really is anti-narrative, the oneness going back to the source, but acknowledging you have to conceptualize the dualism, the Atman and Brahman, in order to go back to the source, which brings me to a discussion I'm having with someone in this corner called Struan Cumming. And we're talking about, he's brought up this idea of what is narrative. And we had a little exchange in which I proposed that Jonathan Pageau's hierarchy is the lowest you can go with narrative. And after that, you've got dualism and monism. Well, he said, no, well, dualism is kind of narrative too, because God creates heaven and earth. So that is the beginning narrative. So really, the only thing that isn't narrative is the monism, is the one. And I think that might be right. That in terms of narrative, really the only way you're going to get to non-representational is to have it be a totality. So Paul says narratives are learned, and I understand that, but are they learned per se? Because you've also got that collective unconscious, so maybe what you learn is how to relate to the collective unconscious, I'm not sure. And you learn the narratives too, but we're born with some innate narratives anyway. So the problem again with narrative is religio narrative or non-narrative? Well, obviously it's both, but let's talk about how it's both. And that brings up the East and West. So F.S.C. Northrop, who was a big influence for Pirsig, described the undifferentiated aesthetic continuum as being the Eastern experience. That's like you pull the experience out of this one. It's undifferentiated, but there's an aesthetic that, let's call it relevance realization or salience, that brings experience out of that continuum. So it's plural, and it's single at the same time. It's a monism, or it's a one, but you bring out narrative from that. And again, that's sort of describing that same pattern. And of course, in Christianity, it would be the grand narrative, which is described by Christianity, and let's just say Jordan Peterson describes that grand narrative in his metaphysics, which is a narrative metaphysics. Pirsig would say the actual experience of quality is certainly non-narrative. It's pre-intellectual. It's unpatterned when you experience, but when you immediately put a face to it, when you are aware of it, you immediately conceptualize it. It immediately becomes narrative. So you put a face to it, so to speak. And Zen is about being in that state of no face. So we have this ongoing divide between, is the bottom of experience narrative or is it not? And I propose that's a temperamental divide to some extent. That's simplifying things, but I think there's an element of truth to that, because there is the need to experience the sacred in a personified way, and the need to experience it as just experience, as mysticism. So remember that politically, we know that there's a temperamental divide politically. Look at John Haidt's work. Look at the Jordan Peterson's Big Five work. It's an absolute divide. And there's a good book called The Highly Sensitive Person, which therapists use a lot. And it just says, well, here are ways that you are going to be extra sensitive because of your temperament. So temperamental inclinations have a lot to do with who you are. And I think that there is something that has something to do with whether you conceive of the religio as narrative or non-narrative. So for Pirsig, it's a back and forth between narrative and non-narrative, how you are in the world, between manifest, static, and potential, dynamic. That is just the nature of reality. Then you go all the way down to the bottom. So is good God, as Pirsig implies, or is the good God, or are quality and God synonymous? Is God the process of quality, or is God the origin of quality? And that's the question, and I don't know if it's even answerable. I don't even know if it should be answered. I think it's the ultimate quan, perpetually there for us to ponder. So my notion of God in the quality lens, is that we always have a choice to stay on the quality track. God gives us the ability, I'm obviously going more in the direction of God being the originator of quality than vice versa. So I'm going to just talk about it from that perspective. God gives us quality. He gives us the ability to detect quality. And so we have a choice to stay on the quality track. So if you're looking at sin in terms of hamartia, it's off the quality track, off course. And quality is always available to us, even in the worst circumstance. Read Viktor Frankl for a perfect discussion of that. So then they talk about dialectic into dialogos. And part of the project seems to be incorporating the circling from Guy Stenstock into Dialogos. John said he had a discussion with Guy about circling is great because it's designed to maintain personal intimacy, but there's no philosophy in it. You're just, from what I've seen, and I'd love to talk to Guy about this if he's interested, is that it's like a verbal meditation. You're in the moment with these other people, meditating in real time in the present. And this language is meant to keep you in the present. That's the way I understand it, and intimately connected with everyone. So, and John's saying, well, you don't actually have any philosophia. So incorporating the act of circling with logos, let's say, with spontaneous creativity of what emerges as quality guides you to play or express or manifest in analog the contents of your boxcars, manifest in verbal analog, which of course, or rhetoric, which of course is everything you know consciously and unconsciously. Everything in the boxcars is everything you know consciously, unconsciously, and the mythos you're embedded in. So then Paul mentioned my project, which I'm having actually a hard time articulating. He articulates it as I'm saying, what are we looking for really? And I think that that's right in a lot of ways. What are we really looking for? What are we trying to do so we have the best possible life or best possible attitude or deal with things in the best possible way? Is it reconnecting with God? Is it a coherent metaphysics? Is it truth, love, all of the above? Does meaning encompass all? Sometimes we're just looking for a little biological quality to conjoin with our intellectual and spiritual experience. And that I'm bringing that up because of what Christopher Mastropietro said in our last discussion about cigarettes. I'm going to cut that clip out. I think it's just so beautiful. And I think it's the beginning of great discussion. Sometimes you just need a little biological quality to help you think, to help your intellectual quality. And I do need to think deeply about where my project is going and probably do a new intro video to this channel. Maybe it's something like, how can we, myself, my loved ones, my clients, obtain true peace of mind? It might be something like that. So what are we trying to get to by addressing the meaning crisis? We have a center. This is what they were talking about. We have a center. We have at the center a longing for everything, and we can see and hunger for. We want. Remember the Jordan Peterson unbearable present and optimal future, the Panksepp seeking system, the drive towards quality, the innate drives towards quality, and that quality is reality. So anything that is made in that drive towards quality. And he said something really, really great, Paul did, about how the angels have sorrow because they can't taste what we have, and we have a sense that nothing short of everything will satisfy it. So in a weird way, you go back to that kind of that kind of dualism, monism. The angels exist in the realm of the all, but they don't have the ability to come out of that and have the biological and experiential experience. The experiential experiences that we have. So you have, and then John Vervaeke says, mystical experience feels like home, but you can't live there. And I think my view is that we're trying to improve our ability to live there more. How can we live more in that peace of mind of the mystical experience. And there's glimpses we have of the real world, of heaven. And I love this word. I want to use it more. I want to explore this more. There are portals into the real world. So the consummation of our longings is a perennial human problem. And the Eastern Buddhist approach is to quiet the longing. And by quieting the longing, then you can find heaven in the present moment, which is nirvana. I'm not clear as to how the Christian parallel of that would be. So John Vervaeke said he was talking again to the educator, Jack Stein, who says we've become so illiterate, we've lost discernment. And this is very true. We have a real problem with sense making because we come into dialogue with preconceived notions. And these are classic value traps in the Pirsigian terms, and possibly ego traps, these preconceived notions. Again, you have to clear yourself of this rubbish to the best of your ability to engage in Dialogos. So I think it's something like this in Dialogos. You have the first level of Dialogos, which is debate, which is defending the value in ego traps. You have conversation, which often has the ego traps with some loosening. You have dialectic, which can be either, which can be using value and ego traps, but optimally doesn't. Remember that in the Phaedrus dialogue, Pirsig says that Socrates was being disingenuous by acting as though he was trying to get to the root of the sophist rhetoric, then using that same rhetoric as a dialectical tool to diminish rhetoric over dialectic. So let's just say there's an example of how in dialectic you could actually use the be in the traps or use the debate methods within dialectic if you're not being authentic. But of course, that's the difference. You want an authentic dialectic. You want a dialectic that does not, that is removed from these traps, that's removed from ego and value traps. I mean, you may be coming into it with your values, but the whole point is to create a third thing. That, I think, is Dialogos. That is where the traps are gone, but you're still in the thinking mind. So the Dialogos is, again, that combination sort of Guy Synsax Sterkeling and the Socratic dialectic, which I think is a really cool idea. And I don't know enough about Plato and Socrates to say anything more about that. By the way, the salient images that John Vervaeke said are barriers instead of being portals to the ground of being, let's say, or the real world. Those are traps. Those are subverting you from quality, and you're looking at these traps rather than through them. You're looking at the screw thinking it's just a screw rather than the cost of the whole motorcycle when that screw is stripped. And if you continue to look at the screw, then that's the problem. When you see how important it's become, then the solutions make themselves known. It's like that monkey trap. When you value the rice over escape, you have to somehow shift your thinking to overcome that barrier and open up to a portal of being able to escape from the rice trap. So toward the end of this discussion, Paul reflects on how when he's doing these YouTubes, he realizes how many ghosts are embedded in him. Ghosts of Plato, of Aristotle, of Bobbing, Kuyper, Athanasius. We are embedded in our mythos, and the mythos is embedded in us, and that's a big element of being a person. And one thing, I don't want to go into the whole personhood thing because I haven't thought it out, but I'm just going to say that I'm going to characterize how I think a person is in Pirsigian terms. So in Pirsigian terms, I think a person is a set of biological, social, and intellectual patterns embedded in a mythos and propelled by quality, definitely to survive, ostensibly to thrive, and ultimately to figure into the bigger project of evolution. So it's a very dynamic thing that is personhood in the Pirsigian sense. Now, Paul, and this is something I've been meaning to talk about, Paul also released a video about Scott Adams. So he kind of beat me to the punch in this. I've been meaning to talk about Scott Adams for a while now. Scott Adams, I think, seems to be a metaphysician. You know, the simulation is a metaphysics, obviously, but it's not his only conception of metaphysics. In one of his recent talks, he pointed to that quantum observed reality as an indication of something which in a way I'm kind of reluctant to endorse publicly, but privately I believe, which is the notion that you can indeed create your own reality, and let's call it manifest. This whole manifestation of reality, of course, becomes law of attraction, all that stuff, and it's co-opted in the name of prosperity. But at its base, the law of attraction and affirmations do have a basis in reality. They're training your relevance realization and then priming both your conscious and unconscious mind to hone in on the components of, what are you going to make salient that can help you go towards whatever you're trying to achieve. And hopefully it's a quality project. That's a whole can of worms in itself, because you can deceive yourself this way. For example, if you just focus on money or sex or something narrow like that, you have to take the downside of that narrowness. This self-deception can be carrying around a bunch of junk in your boxcars, that you have priorities that you shouldn't have. Like Paul said in his talk with John, you wander around with a bunch of stuff from other churches and Hollywood and probably Facebook, who knows. And then a crisis hits and you don't really know how to deal with it. So, of course, the crisis hits, so you run for the security of these ideologies, Yanni or Laurel, or these two opposing forces out of the ether. However, if you can get yourself straight, then I think you can. And of course, in all this sense-making stuff, they say get yourself straight first. Jordan Peterson says that. Everyone says get yourself straight first before you conquer the world. Well, there's a whole group of people who think you should conquer the world first, but they're not in this corner. So therapy, spiritual practice, community, dialogos, those are great ways to start getting yourself straight. And dialogos is something, some of these things I'm starting to see as better therapies. I think dialogos is a great thing that could be brought into the therapeutic world, and I wonder how that can be done. I think I definitely need to talk to Guy. And again, in order to see the good facts, remember in the Poincarean sense, the facts that really mean something, that are going to unite everything you're trying to muddle around with, you have to want to see them, but you also have to know what's good. You have to connect with quality. So doing some spiritual and mental spring cleaning is likely in order, and this is what Paul does for a living. And I guess I do this for a living too. But speaking for myself, I'm constantly cleaning out the junk out of my boxcars, and often there's a lot of nooks and crannies I don't see, sometimes for years. So in closing, I think we should look at the situation as what we're going through as exactly what Paul said, a shamanic disruption that affords new opportunities, courtesy of the Brujo COVID-19. So I hope that makes sense, and I will see you next time.